First, I would say that in Jerome's presentation, he pointed at some common points and differences between the different cities, and I guess Robin will probably address to some others when dealing with Lower Manhattan as an event space in a few minutes. But before speaking of the differences between the reactions or the common points between the social reactions to the terrorist attack, I think we could also consider the distinction between the events themselves as far as their spatial impact within the city is concerned. And in this regard, the Paris case is peculiar for two reasons. The first reason is the little alteration of the public area caused by the attacks in Paris. In New York, Madrid, London, or even Brussels, the attacks were huge bombings, and they actually destroyed all or part of buildings, train, or metro stations. In Paris, we didn't have such destructions because, as you know, the killers killed people one by one. So they did not really destroy the city landscape. And after the events, there was almost nothing which needed to be rebuilt, at least in the outside. Right now, the main outside intervention for construction works is taking place at the Bataclan. And outside of the concert hall, the small scaffolding that you see here is mainly here for a security purpose, as a way to distance people from approaching too close to the building. But most of the construction works is taking place inside. Actually, this photography was taken the very day where the scaffolding was put, and it was the same day as the Brussels attack took place on the 22nd of March. So it was an event in the neighborhood, and it was also an event on the European city scale. So from the point of view of their urban direct destructive impact, the terrorist attacks could be almost invisible in the urban space in Paris and have no impact in the city in itself. In Paris, the terrorist attacks took place in several points of the city, as you know, at two different periods of the year. And each time, most of the attacks took place in the same lively and densely inhabited neighborhood, which could be named after what became its symbolic center, the Republic Square, Place de la République, or after the building where took place the main killing, the Bataclan. So this is a map, a general map of the neighborhood, and the green dot are the places where you had attack either in January or November. And so here it's a zoom. Square at the center is a Republic Square, and here you have two coffee and restaurants, and here you have the Bataclan, here you have Charlie Hebdo, and here the place where the policeman was shot, Amen Merabe. And of course you have other places in Paris, but not in this very small part of the city, which I'm going to talk about today. So in the short time I've got tonight, I would like to raise one main issue, which is at which scale is it meaningful to study the impact of terrorism on the targeted cities and on their public space, public area. As far as Paris is concerned, I will argue that at the first level of analysis, at least, the scale of the neighborhood may be a fruitful one. And there are two ways to investigate it. The first way will be to pay attention to the material traces of the terrorist attacks left or built in the public space since January and November 2015. And the second one is to focus on the social actor invested in and committed to this evocation of the attacks in the street and plazas of the neighborhood. Of course, the interconnections between the two approaches is the most promising path. And looking to the constitution of a memory neighborhood in this district from this perspective shed light on the way the attacks altered the very forms of the public expression and their inscription in the city public area. It's a way to look at the way the public space and of the city was altered by the events. From Charlie Hebdo to Nuit Debout, it leads to reconsider the link between terrorist attacks and social mobilization in the public area, in the city, from Los Indignados in Madrid to Occupy Wall Street, to which Robin may come back in her intervention. So, as Mathieu alluded to, this presentation takes stock of a day-to-day ethnography field work I have been doing in the neighborhood since November 2015. And of course, in the few minutes I have, I will address only a very small part of this material. So for those who want to have a look, I put the address of the blog here. And, but I must say that most of the texts are in French and only a few of them are in English. So the first question I will answer is why choose the scale of the district, of the neighborhood, and how is it possible to gather empirical data at this scale? And the second one will be to consider it only for itself, and for example, as a trauma area, as so many journalists and some colleagues have been looking at it for some months now, but as a way of approaching the broader consequences of the attacks in the very status of Paris public area and Paris city space as a whole. So my first point. The first reason I decided to study the city in the aftermath of the attacks at the scale of the neighborhood is that I live in the core of it. I live halfway between the Republic Square and the Bataclan. And my children's school is in the middle of Charlie Hebdo's office and the Bataclan building. But I also happen to be a social scientist in Paris. And as a sociologist, I specialized in the study of social memory and its localizations. And for several years now, I've been studying the city of Paris as my primary field site. Moreover, as an historian, who I am also, I'm a specialist of the Holocaust, and most of all of the way it was implemented in the 20 districts of the capital. This will have some consequences in what I'm going to say later. But it's not the event itself, but once the event itself was over, that I began sociological observation of the neighborhood. They were provoked by the fact that the memorialization process and an extraordinary event, which I was used to study in periods far removed from my everyday life, were now unfolding in my own neighborhood, in places that I visit every day, and in my home. So this is first this personal experience which led me to begin a sociological study at the scale of the district. But I hope that there are some more reasons, scientific reasons for the adoption of this scale. Of course, looking at the events of the attacks at the scale of the districts, it's not new. One of our American colleagues did the same thing, for example, about the neighborhood of Battery Park City close to 9/11. But again, in the case of New York, for example, the choice of the neighborhood was implied by the fact that the buildings themselves were damaged, and most of the inhabitants had to move away from the district and to come back. So this kind of new relation they had to build to the neighborhood was given by the event. In the Bataclan, or Republic neighborhood, as you want to call it, I don't mind, there was no such process. No one had to move, and no one had his home destroyed or damaged. And there were no representation of the inhabitants of the neighborhood within the group of the victims. Very few of them were living around the Bataclan or around the restaurants and coffees targeted by the attacks. So how then was it possible to assess the particular status of this district scale in itself? I will take here only one example, which will have to do with the flags and the way the French flags were used to dress homes in the neighborhood. So as you may know, an American sociologist, Randall Collins, grasped the impact of the attacks and the reactions of solidarity to 9/11 through a study of the way flags were used to dress homes in the US. However, he looked only to places far from the events and not at neighborhoods around the events or in New York more precisely. In France, on November 25, the French president called people to put flags on their window. And in March this year, so 2011, I walked Paris to pin the flags. So obviously I didn't walk all Paris, but a large part of it. And I will only present 2 districts, but to give you an idea of what we can do. So it was 5 months after the November attacks. A time where, in Randall Collins' analysis, most of the flags had disappeared. But as you see in the map behind, I notice flags. So when you see a bigger ones, there are many flags, more than one. And when you see the small one, it's only one flag. And here is the Bataclan, and here is Charlie Hebdo. And here is where the policeman was shot. So I couldn't speak very long on this map, but I'm not going to, but we can have a discussion in the general discussion. Here, I'm just going to use it as a way to compare it to a second one, which is a map done at the same part of the year. This time not in the 11th arrondissement around the Bataclan, but in the 8th arrondissement, which is known to be of a different political orientation in France, more right-wing and more politically inclined to use the national colors. While in the Bataclan neighborhood, the electoral behavior is more left-wing one and pro-European. By the way, it's the only place in Paris where I found some European flags at the windows in March. So if you compare the 2 maps, you can suggest that there is a form of neighborhood effects to the kind of reaction to the events. It's a way to grasp some of it. So once, through the example, but again I could take more, once the interest to consider the city transformation at the scale of a neighborhood is acknowledged, how can we proceed? A first group of study already into process, and Jérôme is participating in some of them, pay major attention to the inhabitants through oral interviews and without observing the urban space transformation. And most of these works, not all, ask one main question: to what extent are the inhabitants traumatized or resilient? The second approach is to begin by looking at the public area itself, its transformations, and the way it is invested, and by whom. Of course, the most interesting approach is to link the 2. It is indeed striking to see how the public area in the neighborhood and the occupation of this public area have become an issue and something socially at stake between people and groups. For example, less than 10 people were dead at the Bataclan were inhabitants of the arrondissement. However, one of the 2 main associations gathering the victims, the people who were at the Bataclan on November 13, the association is called Life for Paris, decided to organize a party in a public park of the district for what we call the Neighbor Days in Paris on May 28. And it turned out that no neighbors turned up. The fact of the attacks and the memorialization of the public area in this part of the city created both an interest to occupy the streets of the neighborhood and this plaza, but also created some conflicts around this very occupation. As soon as Monday, 28th of December, I was making observations at République Square, where the main grassroots memorial has been implemented as soon as January 2015. So I guess all of you have seen the picture, but I put some example of the 2 grassroots memorial, the 2 main grassroots memorial we had in the neighborhood. The first one is at République, and the second one is in front of the Bataclan. So at République this day had witnessed a strong argument between a man, so you see him here, standing on the base of the statue, his hands full of papers, and a woman perched on a bicycle, which will state later that she lives here, around the plaza. The man has picked up some of the papers and letters left there by passers-by in homage to the victims of the attack. So the woman says, "You're not allowed to. It's not up to you to take these letters." And the man replies, "I'm not taking them. I'm going to laminate them to protect them." He's going to use plastic to take care of it. And the woman insists, "If people put them there like that, then that's their right. And it's not a problem that they got damaged or destroyed. I like it when the flowers fade." And he answers, "But people didn't think to laminate them. Of course, they're very emotional. We laminate them so that they last." I went to see him and I asked him who is the we he refers to. And he says, "I'm with a group that aims to pay homage to the victims and preserve the homages people have paid to them." It will turn out that this group of around 20 people has been called oneself 17 Never Again, in reference to the 17 victims of January 2015 in Paris. And they have been taking in charge the grassroots memorials up to now at République. This example of interaction is the first one of a long list of observations of the struggle for the appropriation of the homage, of course, but also of the public area, conflict of appropriation born from the attacks and from the public reaction to them in the urban space. So since January, this group has been taking care of the grassroots memorial. So I put you some example of the work. So here she puts trashes in a bag. And they created a logo, and here is staging some of the popular pieces left here in reaction to the Brussels attack on March, and is making some permanent presentation and for the memorial at République. As in this picture, the privatization of memory and so doing of the public space of the city has intensified since the November attacks. For the first anniversary of the attacks, in January 2016, the government and the town council of Paris were to plant 70 olive trees on the Place de la République, and thus was trying to reclaim both the public space and the memory of the events, which they had left gone since January, since no one from the state came here to classify or to take some of the documents. Finally, the government only inaugurated a small memory oak, as you see in this picture, because in the meantime, the November attack happened, so they didn't have the time to imagine a new way of commemoration. And here, just for you to figure, the oak is here, and here you have the grassroots memorial around the statue at République. Here, as you will see, all this part of the plaza is the part of the power of the legal institutions. It's where you have the oak. It's where, because I'm not going to have time, but it's where, as you may have heard, the policemen had their demonstration in Paris in May. And this part of the plaza that right now the city hall is trying to reconquer. And here is the subversive part of the plaza, because since the attacks, all this urban space has become a place for struggle and contestation of occupation. And so it's here where you have Nuit Debout since last March. And here is an example of this struggle for the occupation and memorialization of the urban space at République. In March, when the demonstrations against the reform of the labor law began in Paris, the government tried to protect all the text and images at the grassroots memorial, so they put some grills around the statue, and the 17 Never Again reacted in conflict, taking some card to write République fermée, it means Republic closed, and forgotten victims. So this was written by one of the friends of the guy you saw on the picture. And some people, some passers-by, they put a plaque plus arbre à 50 mètres. It means that if you go a little more further, you can see the official commemoration, the memory oak planted by the government, and the plaque which goes by. So this is a perfect illustration of the fight on the different space of commemoration in the neighborhood. And of course, if the appropriation of the public space of the city by the group of 17 Never Again is extreme, it is not isolated. Since January 2015, more than 30 non-profit organizations, in French, les associations Loi 1901, have been created to commemorate the 2015 Paris attacks and its victims, and most of them pretend at some kind of action and rights in the city public area. Only a few of them were made of residents, as in the case of the Charlie Neighbors group, gathering families living in Rue Nicolas Appert, which is the street of the journal office. And for example, their kind of actions, they decided to paint in bright colors some of the posts of the streets they live in. And I'm going to pass quickly, but Nuit Debout constituted a new stage in the privatization of the public area of the district of the attacks. Facilitated by the state's inability to adequately take responsibility for its memorialization on the Place de la République, and more broadly to organize this new social relation to the public area in the district. So here it's a picture of one of the interactions I observed at République during Nuit Debout, and here they are having what they call Éducation Populaire, People's Educational Council at Nuit Debout, and someone is presenting the Michel Foucault concept of heterotopie, another place, and is saying, okay, here Nuit Debout could be an example of heterotopia. It is another place, some place where we can imagine something totally new. And the woman, she stood up and she said, no, it's not possible, because République is not a new place. It's a place where so many things took place. And for everyone there, the reference to the reactions to the terrorist attacks was very clear. So the installation of, I'm almost done. The installation of Nuit Debout was a very extreme incarnation of the struggle over public area in the district. And it echoes to Jérôme's presentation. It went with new discourse and messages and interpretation of the events. During the day, the member of the group 17 Never Again continued to maintain the grassroots memorial and to entertain some non-politically engaged materials like we want the peace, we love each other, and this kind of messages. And during the night, the people of Nuit Debout, of course, they wrote social messages about the labor law, but not only. And a lot of these messages was linked to the evocation of the terrorist attacks. For example, I took one example: no guerre, no more. Vos guerres no more. Your wars are dead, which is a reflection of all the tune of the messages written by Nuit Debout in this occupation. And around the conflict over the occupation of the public space, there is also a conflict of interpretation, of political interpretation, which is with some relations to what Jérôme just said, of the attacks and of the way the country and the politicians have to answer to it. Okay. So I spoke quickly, but we could come back about the policeman demonstration. They chose the plaza to do their demonstration because it was a way for them to privatize once more the place. So, and it's my conclusion, since a few weeks, the Paris City Hall has been planning the commemoration of November 13, because with the summer break, November is almost there. And in doing so, and very logically, the councillors to the mayor realized that first they had to take control again of the urban space in the district. So they began with the occupation of the western side of the square. So as I show you, the one, the power and institutional and official part of the space, of the place, where the presidential tree stands. This is a picture of this new occupation, so this is an official one, and since June 21, an exhibition presenting figures of refugees in Paris and created in cooperation with the UN, occupy half of the plaza. A few days later, a skate park appeared on the east side, the one of Nuit Debout, and was almost immediately followed by the installation of a large sports festival making available free activities for children and adults. And in the middle of all this, the grassroots memorial, even now limited in its dimension, still exists, and every day the neighborhood hosts a new group of people willing to express its opinion and its feelings publicly. More than a memory neighborhood, or maybe because it is first a memory neighborhood, this district became the place for public expression, inviting to reconsider the beginning and the end of the events of the attacks as the frontier of the city public space. So this is a grassroots left, and this is an example of this kind of new occupation of the plaza. It's a group of Mormons, predicators, most of them coming from the US, and they chose for the first time Republic Square to host their public event and try to convert people. For example, they tried with me because I went to ask them why they chose this place, and so they tried to explain me about Jesus Christ and so on. So, and here they wrote everything down as people of Nuit Debout have been doing for months now. However, the very issue of what to say politically about the terrorist attacks is still unresolved. And still for the preparation of the November 13 commemoration, so far the City Hall has been asking different groups about their opinion, encouraging again the privatization of the memory of the attack, which with no doubt will incarnate itself in new forms of occupation in the space of the city. Thank you.